Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on strategies to mitigate against foodborne pathogens. My name is Holly Cardozo. I'm a member of the marketing team for SIA Global, and I'm pleased to welcome you today. Before we begin, we'll review a few housekeeping items just so you can understand how to connect with us. Firstly, you'll note that you're muted upon entry of the webinar. And if you have trouble seeing us, I invite you to refer back to your registration link. This will get you to both seeing and hearing the presentation. Should you wish to connect with us during the webinar, you may do so in one of two ways. You can respond to our quick poll questions. We have two today, and we'll be happy to share the results so you can see where you sit amongst your peers. And the other way you may interact with us is by submitting a question, and I encourage you to do so as you think of them. Just type them in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You may collapse this, the software to the right of your screen by clicking on those three small arrows, and you can reopen that box by clicking on those three small arrows a second time as well. Wonderful. So our presenter today is Dr. Bob Strong. He joins us from our consulting and training portfolio. He's a senior consultant with SIA Global, a very big component of our food safety operations in the area of GMP and GFSI standards. He has a wealth of experience with over 45 years in the food industry with all shapes and sizes of organizations, speaks in a number of different areas, GMP, HACCP, preventive controls, and obviously one of our lead trainers as well. So with that, Dr. Bob, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you, and welcome today.
Thank you, Holly, and welcome to everybody. Happy that folks are signing up. As usual, we get quite an attendance at these one-hour webinars, and the intention is to hit on some things that would be topical and of interest to you. It's not a deep dive because it's difficult to do a deep dive in 1 hour. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the most common foodborne pathogens that are causing concern for you as a manufacturer and to the consumer. We're going to talk about some of the most major recalls we've had over the last 20 years and the challenges that that's brought to companies and the challenges that these pathogens bring to you to avoid being one of those major recalls. We're going to talk about some of the consequences that these companies have suffered from, which have been rather disastrous in most cases. And we're going to talk about those pathogens that are of the greatest risk, so you can focus on them versus focusing on just everything. We're going to focus down onto a few of them that are the greatest risk. And we're going to talk about how you can hopefully avoid having a recall due to one of these pathogens. Because when we talk about pathogens and we talk about recalls, and obviously you all remember that the leading recall is actually an allergen, but we're going to concentrate today on pathogens. We're talking about Salmonella, Clostridium botulinum, E. coli species, which years ago we used to think of as only 015787, and we weren't thinking about other species of E. coli being pathogenic. Campylobacter, Listeria Monocytogenes. And we look back just over the last 20 years, and we're talking only the last 20 years, and we see major things like in 1997, we saw Hudson Foods recall 25 million pounds of ground beef due to E. coli. And then we saw Sara Lee just a year later with 35 million pounds recalled and 21 deaths due to Listeria Monocytogenes. And then we go on to 2002 and we see Pilgrim Pride. These are big name companies, or big name at that time, 27 million pounds of cooked turkey and chicken, therefore ready to eat, Listeria Monocytogenes. And then we look at Tops frozen ground beef products. And at the time that Tops had this problem, they were the largest producer of frozen patties in the United States. What's common about those four, if you'll notice, they're all meat and poultry products. And so back in those days, the biggest recalls were meat and poultry, but that isn't true today. And that started somewhat with 2008 with Peanut Corporation America. And now we started talking about Salmonella, and we started talking about peanut butter. And who would have believed that you could have Salmonella in peanut butter when you've roasted the peanuts? And who would have thought that people would have gone to jail? And then we get into 2010, and again, eggs, Salmonella, then cargo in 2011, 35 million pounds pulled back Salmonella. Now, the first four we were talking about were E. coli and Listeria. Now, all of a sudden, we've had three major recalls in a row due to Salmonella. Then we get up to 2016, and we have two in 1 year. One of them due to an E. coli 121, not 0157. And this was, again, in flour. We don't know much about that, unfortunately, because General Mills invoked the Secrecy Act, so we didn't learn as much as we'd like to learn about why that happened, etc. The same year, we had CFR with the frozen fruits and vegetables, 358 consumer products, 42 brands recalled due to Listeria Monocytogenes. And then this year, and it's still ongoing right now, J.B. Tollison, one of the largest manufacturers of ground beef, pulling back 14 million pounds, and we're not sure that's the beginning and the end of that number. That number seems like it keeps increasing every time there's a news release. And this is a major company again with Salmonella. So I decided, well, I'll go just look and see what type of recalls we've had this year, just based on the three ones we just talked about. Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, and E. coli. And this information you can pull from the FDA and the USDA websites and see what type of recalls. And what do we find? We find it's across the board now. We're finding it's more ready to eat than it is meat. And so therefore, on top of the different types of products now that are causing the recalls due to these pathogens. And we see that Listeria is 33 of the recalls, 26 due to Salmonella. And maybe the only good news is that E. coli has not caused too many recalls in 2018. Yet if you went back 20 years ago, E. coli was certainly one of the leading causes of products being recalled. So I think what we have to understand is it's not necessarily that these harmful bacteria are going away. It's just, unfortunately, we're getting on top of someone, and some of them apparently we're allowing them to continue to get on top of us. And so therefore, we're going to have our first poll and see what you feel is your biggest concern about these five.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Bob. So I'll launch the poll here. We'll give about 30 seconds to select your response. So which pathogen is your organization most concerned about? So we have them listed here. I'll invite you to select your response. What would you say, Dr. Bob? What do you think most organizations, which pathogen are they most worried about?
Well, they're doing ready to eat, and most likely Listeria monocytogenes. If they're not doing ready to eat, I would suspect it's either Salmonella or E. coli.
Yeah, okay. So we've got, that was a really quick response. Thanks, everyone. So let me close and share the results. So unsurprisingly, Listeria is, of course, number one, and Salmonella a close second there.
All right, we want to ask you another question to ask you which of these do you feel is the most challenging for you to mitigate, therefore control, get rid of?
Yeah, great. So I've launched again. I invite you to select your response. So it's one thing to be concerned about it, that it might surface, but it's perhaps another to be worried about actually being able to mitigate and prevent it from surfacing. What would you say here, Dr. Bob? What would be your estimation?
I think Listeria monocytogenes is an environmental pathogen in a ready-to-eat plant, is the one that keeps people up at night.
Yep, certainly by the news stories of late, I would say. And unsurprisingly, let me close and share the results. It is indeed at 69% Listeria.
Well, obviously, you're recognizing what food business, and they're challenging because they're there. And we know they're there. And the point is, where are they, and how can we avoid them being in our finished product? Because these pathogens exist naturally. They're out in the fields. They're inside animals that are getting slaughtered. And so it's not like you can say, we're going to eradicate them from the face of the earth and they're not going to be a problem. But the problem is they then come into your plant. So some of you bring them in the plant. You can't avoid bringing them in the plant, particularly if you're bringing in things like raw meat, or you're bringing in vegetables with soil on, etc. The question is, how are you controlling from bringing it in and not then sending it out, particularly if you're making a ready-to-eat product? Not all of these pathogens are as deadly to the consumer as others are. But it doesn't mean you can send out your product with a pathogen in it, even though it doesn't have such a high mortality rate. But which ones are really scary if they're in the finished product and the consumer's going to eat it because it's ready to eat? It's not just a North American problem. And therefore, one of the things we are challenged with these days is we are bringing our product and our raw materials from around the world. So sometimes you're bringing in problems from other countries that naturally would be better controlled in America, but now you're going to be held accountable for bringing in that product from a farm in a foreign country where they may be not controlling it as well. And then you get into media attention, and with the all the software program, I mean, all of the social media programs and everything. When you have a problem, it isn't too long before a lot of people know about it, whereas in the old days, you would have said it took a while for people to know about it, and sometimes they never did get to know about it. Now they know about it in a matter of minutes, days, and it's very hard to hide your problems away. So when we look at the consequences that if you put out a product that's going to cause people to get sick or unfortunately die, you're going to get into problems with regulators, and therefore it becomes a real major problem right now with regulators. Both USDA and FDA become more aggressive. We're going to talk about the cost of recalls, which can be anything from 3 to 100 million, with an average being 30 million. So it's not a small cost when you have a recall. Then we got lawyers coming after you, excuse me, causing a death. And the average cost now per death is $10 million. Can you survive that? Or is bankruptcy possibly in the future of your company? And if it's not bankruptcy, will the regulators close you down? And then if you close, will you reopen? So are the job losses going to be temporarily, or are they going to be permanent? And when you say temporary, how long is that? And what are your workers going to do without a paycheck? And if they go somewhere else, are you going to get them back when you reopen? The same with your customers. Once you lose them, how hard is it to get them back? And when you lose the consumer, do they come back and buy your product again? So the GMA, the Grocery Manufacturers Association, we've had this slide up several times because we want to keep bringing it back for you to understand the cost of an impact. The impact of a recall. And we're talking here, as you can see, sometimes it can be 100 million. But even when there isn't 100 million, let's go to the low end to go 3 million. Can your business survive if you have a $3 million recall where you're going to take most of the costs yourself? I'm not sure that you are going to survive that unless you're a really big company and what you've got is what they call deep pockets. Then maybe you can survive. But let's look at what happened to some of these companies over the last 20 years that have had these recalls. And it was because they invoked the Secrecy Act, but we do know they recalled up to about 75 million pounds of flour, which had that E. coli in it. And then that can't have been very inexpensive. It had to be very expensive. In the case of Tops, they closed. They don't exist. Hudson Foods closed. They opened up under a different name. So therefore they closed. And that was due to E. coli. And then we look at Listeria and the vegetable and fruit packer, they closed, and they were closed for several years. Now they reopened again, but they were closed for several years, and they reopened because somebody bought them and somebody brought fresh money. Pilgrim Pride's closed. Sara Lee suffered tremendous bad publicity. They didn't actually close, but the publicity was so bad, and the Sara Lee name is a little harder to find these days than it was back in those days when they had the recall, when Sara Lee was a big national brand. You look at Toleson's right now, bad publicity. Cargill's bad publicity. Hillendale with the eggs, people went to jail. PCA, people went to jail. And both of those last two operations are closed. So when we talk about what's the scariest one, and we agree with you, and so therefore I wasn't surprised when you picked Listeria Monocytogenes as the one you feel that you're most afraid of, and the one you feel is the hardest to control. Because when you look at it, when we go back into the 90s, and the Listeria infections were generally associated with meat, deli meats, and hot dogs. But today we're finding it is with ready-to-eat products, so it's dairy and produce. And this is a brochure that's put out by CDC to warn everybody about Listeria because it's so serious, and certainly to those who have somewhat of a compromised immune system. And that may be the baby in the womb of the pregnant woman. And so we have to say, you're right, it is the scary thing that's in the room. And what do we know about Listeria monocytogenes? Well, first of all, in 1981, before we even knew it was of human health concern, it's in ubiquitous. Now, what does that mean? It's all around us. It's out in the field. It's around us, and it comes into your plant. So it's not like you can't say it isn't there. It is. It's not like you can't say we don't bring it into our plant, because in some cases you are. The point is, if you're going to make a ready-to-eat product, you better not go back out in that ready-to-eat product. So where is it? It's in the soil. So what type of products would bring it in? Products with soil on it, like produce. You're bringing in raw meats. You're bringing in raw fish. You're bringing in soft cheeses, particularly if they're made out of unpasteurized milk, or you're actually bringing in unpasteurized milk. And then, of course, we have those 33 deaths with cantaloupes. So do you purchase any of those? Then if you do, the chances are you're bringing Listeria monocytogenes into your facility. That's not the problem. The problem is, are you recognizing that in your hazard analysis, do you have some type of a forensic control to avoid it going out in a finished, ready-to-eat product? If not, you're going to have a problem. And the consumer's going to have a problem, because this is the most deadly of these pathogens that we're talking about. 20 to 25% of the people who get listeriosis finish up, unfortunately, dying. That is not the percentage with the other bacteria. It's much lower than that. And about 65% of the people finish up having to go to the hospital and put on UV drips because they're losing fluids. So where are you going to be more susceptible? In your packaging area, where you've allowed the Listeria to get in the packaging area, and you're making a ready-to-eat product, and you're now allowing it to go out. So we're going to talk a minute about your environmental monitoring program, and the fact that if you don't have an aggressive monitoring program and you finish up with Listeria in there, you're going to have problems with regulators, you're going to have problems with the safety of your finished ready-to-eat product, and you're going to have problems with lawyers and the consumer getting sick. Now, whether you want to be swabbing for more than Listeria is up to you. If you don't feel Salmonella is something you're bringing in, and the raw materials you're bringing in are not traditionally associated with Salmonella, and the same with E. coli, then you would maybe restrict your program on environmental swabbing to just Listeria species. And you would then basically consider that if I can find Listeria species, I'm going to assume that it's Listeria monocytogenes, and I'm going to have to do something about it in the environment. Because again, you cannot operate a packaging room where you've got Listeria monocytogenes in that room, and you're packing off ready-to-eat products which are exposed prior to you totally enclosing them. And so therefore, you have to have a very aggressive program. And it has to be aggressive that you're trying to find Listeria monocytogenes, not trying not to find it. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But then we can't ignore the fact that you may be bringing in Salmonella. So where do we commonly find that? In contaminated eggs. So why did we have that big recall back several years ago? We've had another one just this year. It's because when you have chicks who are born and they're going to be raised to lay eggs, then you have to be checking their droppings for Salmonella enteritidis, and it's a normal cost of doing business. The bad news is if you find it, all the chicks have to be slaughtered. You then have to check their droppings about once a month for the life of those hens as they grow to become hens and start laying eggs. And that's a cost, but that's a cost of doing business. And at any time you find Salmonella enteritidis in the droppings, you have to slaughter all the hens that are in that laying house. Well, heck, if you don't want to spend that money, then you don't test, and now all of a sudden you finish up with Salmonella inside the eggs. versus Salmonella on the outside of the eggs, which can be washed off. Both those companies got in trouble when not doing that type of testing. You can buy now pasteurized eggs, which are still raw in the shell, cost you a little bit more money. So if you're worried about it being on the outside of the eggs, you can even buy an egg that is being flash pasteurized. You're bringing in raw poultry and meat, unpasteurized milk, contaminated raw fruits and vegetables, and I can go on down this list. This is what should be in your hazard analysis. You've analyzed every one of the ingredients coming in, and you said, are they likely to have Listeria in them? Are they likely to have Salmonella in them? Are they likely to have E. coli? And then you recognize that you're bringing in those pathogens. And then you have to decide, what am I going to do about it now that I know I got a probability that I'm bringing it in? Because where does E. coli come from? It only comes from fecal matter. And how's it spread? If you buy from a slaughterhouse that isn't doing the job as well as they should, they're not keeping the fecal material off the meat, of the poultry and the meat when they're slaughtering the animal, and you're getting it coming in. Now, if they're doing a really good job, they should be getting rid of it at the meat and poultry plant, where they're slaughtering and fabricating. But if they're not, that's what you're bringing in. If you're buying crops that are coming off a farm and they've got cattle pens close by, and if you go back and read the Yuma problem this year with romaine lettuce, this is what the source was, then that E. coli from their manure gets into the canals spray the water onto the crops, and you buy the crops. If you're buying from a farmer who's using manure to fertilize his crops, now you can legally do that, but there are a lot of things he has to do to make sure he's doing that safely. Is he doing it safely? Do you know he's doing it safely? If not, the chances are you're bringing in E. coli on some of your raw vegetables coming out of the fields. So contaminated water misuse of manure is a bigger problem in certain countries. So you say, well, we're doing a pretty good job in America, and we generally are, but is every other country you're buying your produce from doing such a great job? Chances are they most likely are not. So therefore you would be looking at them a little bit more seriously on how they're running their farms in those other countries. Now, Clostridium botulinum tends not to be a big problem, but when it is a problem, it's a killer, because this is a bacteria that forms a poison, and the poison paralyzes you. The only good news is we're not having many problems, but you can't afford to have a problem with Clostridium botulinum. So where is it formed, or where does it happen? It comes in soil. And therefore, when you're canning things off, and you create an anaerobic condition, and then you don't process it properly, you can have it grow in that can. But I'm not canning. I'm just going ahead and I'm taking a product and I'm vacuum packing it. Then you created anaerobic conditions, and unless you're going to store that product at 37 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, you can grow the botulism poison because the conditions are now favorable for it to grow. And that's why canned fish, canned vegetables, fermented salty smoked fish, and other meat products do have their problems, and you do see them recalled. The only good news is a doctor now is much more skilled in noticing that you have botulism poisoning. You are having an appendicitis, and would open you up to take out your appendix to find out your appendix are in good condition because they misdiagnosed you. But we've educated the doctors much better now that they're more likely to show and know you're showing symptoms of botulism poisoning and get you into a hospital and get you to a respirator. So if you do start to get paralyzed, the respirator takes over. And so deaths due to botulism these days are very few and far between. Doesn't mean that you ignore the fact that botulism could be the sleeping giant in the room. How about Campylobacter? This is one where we're not really winning. The thing about it is it's a milder illness, so it gets totally underreported. And so what it says is an estimated 1.3 million illnesses a year. I think you could basically say That's not the ones that are confirmed. That's an estimate based on, that's what we believe from the ones that we know where people get sick. And where's it associated? Well, poultry. I think the poultry industry would admit that about 50% of all poultry has Campylobacter on it. We need to get those numbers down. How do we handle it now? People generally cook the poultry real well, and that takes care of the problem. But it really doesn't take care of the fact that it shouldn't be there in the first place. And undercooked meat, unpasteurized milk, contaminated water. So are you bringing those things into your plant? Therefore, you have to think about bringing in Campylobacter now as well. So when we talk about these things, what we want to highlight here with you is you have to know what you're bringing in. And that's why when you look at preventive controls for human foods put out under FSMA by the FDA, they basically said the most important part of your preventive controls program, or if you want to call it a HACCP program, is that you do a thorough hazard analysis and know what you're bringing in. And if you can avoid bringing it in, then obviously you don't have to worry about eliminating it or reducing it, because those are your three choices: eliminate, prevent, or reduce. Well, if you can get somebody else to basically prevent it being there, then you don't have to get into eliminate or reduce. But that's not possible with some things. You can't go back to a raw meat supplier and say, don't send me any raw meat with salmonella on it. Because they're going to say to you, we'll try our best, but we can't guarantee it. Don't send me any raw meat with Campylobacter on it. They're actually going to say to you, it comes with raw meat, it's your job to take care of it. Now, if you said to them in the case of ground beef, don't send me any ground beef with E. coli in it, by law, they're not supposed to send you that, and that product is considered adulterated. So I think we're starting to get on top of that until all of a sudden J.D. Tolleson had a problem, but it wasn't E. coli this time, it was Salmonella. Do you bring in produce? Then you can't go to the farmer and say, I don't want you to send me any soil on the produce with any bacteria in it, because the farmer's going to look at you and say, we don't have the ability to wash it off. We don't have the ability to take care of it. We'll try to prevent it in the fields, but Mother Nature is what we're up against, and we'll do our best. And there are produce food safety guidelines that are being put on farmers now that go into effect over the next several years. So you are going to see a lot more government regulations in the fields, but it won't eliminate a lot of the stuff that's coming in your plant. Hopefully it will reduce it. And maybe in some cases it will stop it on certain produce. But then some of the supplies you've got are in foreign countries and they don't come under the FDA or the USDA. But one of the things the FDA says, you have to make sure that foreign supplier is operating in their farms, in their plants as if they were in America. So don't forget, if you're going to be the FSVP importer, the responsibility is on your shoulders to make sure that foreign supplier is doing what they're supposed to be doing as if they were actually located here in the USA. Do you sell a ready-to-eat product? If you do, you're going to have a plant that's at a much higher level of sanitation than if you're not. Doesn't mean I said you can have a dirty plant. It just means that you don't have to have such a high level of sanitation in that packaging room if you're not selling a ready-to-eat product. Do you have a customer that can carry the pathogen? So when you sell your product, is it clear to the consumer or your customer that you're not selling a ready-to-eat product, and they know it's a ready-to-cook product, and they know what temperature to cook it to, because you're asking them to take care of the pathogen. And if they don't understand that and they don't take care of it, unfortunately, with us being such a litigious society, they find a lawyer and the lawyer comes and sues you and says you didn't really tell them what they were supposed to be cooking the product to and why they were supposed to be cooking the product. And so therefore it was lack of you educating the customer, which unfortunately is their argument, whether you buy it or not. So therefore you come back to which of the pathogens are you worried about, which ones have the high profile, which ones cause people to go to hospital, which ones would kill people, and am I selling a ready-to-eat product? And therefore you base your whole food safety programs based on that, because you can't afford to do anything else. So let's come back to Listeria. And we built this knowing what your answers were going to be. And so we wanted to cycle back to Listeria Monocytogenes in ready-to-eat facilities, because this is the scary elephant in the room. This is where we know that the FDA is coming in and doing swabathons. And this is where the USDA is aggressive as well. When you're making a ready-to-eat product, they know Listeria is going to be a problem for the consumer. So the regulators can't take a soft approach on this. They have to take an aggressive approach. And therefore they're saying to you, you're in charge of your plants. You have to be very aggressive. And if you're not, we're going to start impounding your product, recalling your product, and maybe even closing you down. So the message here to you and obviously to your management people is there should be no compromising on sanitation. You should have enough sanitation people to do the job. They should be well trained, and they should be incentivized to do a good job, and you should hold them at the highest level in your esteem of them, because if they don't do the job, you're in a world of trouble. And yet sometimes we compromise how much time they get. We have them paid maybe the lowest scale in the plant, and yet they're the most important people in your plant. The second most important people in your plant are the maintenance people. And that doesn't mean that the A-square practitioner and the PCQI person isn't important, but somehow we feel that the other people in maintenance and packaging aren't as important. Maybe I should phrase it that way. And if you're not putting the money into the building and not putting money into the equipment, then you're going to generate areas where Listeria is going to live. And if it's going to live there and you can't get rid of it, you're heading towards that packaging area being closed down. There's no doubt about it. But if you maintain your equipment and you don't have little niches in the equipment or in the building where the Listeria can live, because you're maintaining a really good building and really good equipment and it's all cleanable, then your chances of having a Listeria become a resident in that area is going to be much less. So therefore we get to the fact that you've got to be very aggressive in your environmental monitoring program to convince management that we have an issue. We have a sleeping giant in the room. And one of these days is going to pop out and drop into one of our ready-to-eat products, and we're going to finish up with a recall, people sick, hopefully nobody dead, and we're going to have lawyers after us and regulators after us. So now I want to try to find it. You don't swab when it's clean. You just find it. Because if it's there when it's dirty, that means it's in the room when your product's exposed, and that's when you don't want it to be in the room. But if you're only going to swab when it's clean, all you're saying is after we finish up cleaning, life's good. But your product's all put away then. And the next morning when you start off, yes, it may still be good, but then an hour later, 2 hours later, all of a sudden, if you were swabbing, the Listeria is there. And there are many plants that will tell you they find the Listeria after they've been running for an hour or two, which means it's supposed to be oozing out of some conveyor belt, out of some ball bearings, out of some equipment that's moving, and wasn't moving when they did the swabbing the night before after cleanup, and wasn't moving the next morning if they did swabbing before they started. So they weren't finding it, but it was there. It was just waiting to start oozing out. So therefore, you need a program that's going to help you manage your swabbing, because you shouldn't be swabbing at the same time every day, and you shouldn't be swabbing after you're clean. And you need to vary your swabbing. So you're swabbing on a Monday, you're swabbing on a Tuesday, you're swabbing on first shift, you're swabbing on second shift, you're swabbing on a Saturday, you're swabbing on a Monday after you've been closed all weekend, you're swabbing after you've been running 1 hour. And I'm not talking about swabbing food contact surfaces. Don't do that, except in the USDA plant where you have to. I'm talking about swabbing on the floor. I'm talking about getting down there. And if you're doing that and you're not finding it, the chances are it ain't there. But if you're finding it, then you have to find where it's coming from. And then you have to follow up. And don't just keep going to the drain. Oh, I find Listeria in the drain. Yes, you did, because it washed across the floor and went in the drain. But that wasn't where it was coming from. So if all you're doing is cleaning the drain, then you're not finding the source. And you got to find the source. Is it coming off a wheel of a cart? And as I said, I can't do enough on this in 1 hour. And that's why we're talking about maybe doing a whole day classes. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. How's it getting in that room? It's coming in on the wheels of carts or pallet jacks or pallets or people. And you've got to control what comes into that packaging area and limit what's in that area and limit what's in that area to possibly being kept in that area and dedicated to that area. And that includes cleaning equipment, and that includes pallets, and includes everything. And things should be coming out of that room, and there's minimum going into that room, and that's people and everything. But is it a room? I go to a lot of plants, it's not a room, it's a part of a big room. And therefore you've got this big room now with the sleeping giants in the big room now. And now you've got to start monitoring the big room, because it doesn't matter whether it is in that room, it's going to get in the air. But if I can make that a smaller room and call it a packaging room, and so you may have to start walling off your packaging area in order for you to get that level of sanitation that you need in that room, because you're making a ready-to-eat product. You may have to put a positive air pressure in that room so that everything blows out and nothing blows in. And the last thing you need is pooling water. Whether it's coming from a leaking sink, a leaking faucet, the floor doesn't drain properly, and then you've got all the conditions for Listeria. Now let's make it a cold room and make it a wet room with pooling water. We're increasing your chances of having a problem. So therefore, where possible, let's try not to bring in the Listeria. Let's try not to bring in the Salmonella. Let's try not to bring in the E. coli. So can you get your supplier to control it? If you can, then you push it back to a supplier preventive control. And remember, under preventive controls, you had 4 choices. You had a process preventive control, which is like a CCP and HACCP plan. You had a allergen preventive control, which obviously applies to allergens. You had a Listeria or environmental preventive control, which is called a sanitation preventive control when you're doing ready to eat. And you had a supplier preventive control for anything that you can push back to your supplier, but then make sure they're doing it. If not, you have to recognize you're bringing these things in. And you can't say I'm not bringing them in, because they are associated with the type of raw materials that you buy. And if your supplier's not taking care of them, then you're bringing them in. And so you say, well, okay, now I'm going to be really concerned about my ready-to-eat areas. What should I swab for? Well, generally you're going to swab for Listeria species. And you're going to do that definitely in wet areas. But I would say do it in dry areas. It doesn't mean Listeria just lives in wet areas. It just prefers wet areas. But it can grow in dry areas, and it can live in areas. Salmonella is generally found in dry areas. Doesn't mean that you wouldn't swab in a wet area, but you're more inclined to swab for it in a dry area. And it can live there for months and months and months, and it can become a resident. And so therefore, sometimes when you get Salmonella in, it's awful hard to get it out, particularly if it starts to get into the bricks and everything. You've got to avoid these pathogens being brought into the packaging area. You've got to do whatever you can to stop that happening. But if you're not, you're going to have a problem. So let's do a little summary, and then we'll take questions and answers. And we realize that this isn't a deep enough dive for some of you who are looking to get more information. So we are talking about extending this to maybe running, we're going to run these 1-hour webinars and continue with these, but we're going to also add some longer ones that are going to be virtual training. And these will last more of a day, length of a day, and we'll bring that information to you shortly in the future. Well, let's talk about wrapping this one up. So are you bringing into your facility pathogens? That's one of the first questions you have to ask yourself. Am I bringing into my facility pathogens? And we just named 5 of them, and we started to focus on 3 of them. And if the answer is yes, then you know you're bringing them in. So now you got to have something that you're going to do to control them. unless you're selling a product that the consumer assumes there's salmonella still in it, like raw poultry, and that the consumer is going to cook the product. Then you could pass the pathogen on to the consumer. Do you make a ready-to-eat product? Then you don't have that choice to pass it on to the consumer or your customer, because by definition it's ready to eat, and the person buying your product is going to take it out of the package and eat it, and they rightfully are going to assume that it's safe to eat. Are you controlling your packaging room? So first question is, do you have a packaging room or a packaging area? And are you controlling what goes in and out of that room? And are you trying to stop the pathogens that you're bringing in that you can't avoid, which are down at the dirtier end? And I say dirtier in italics, dirtier end of the plant. How are you stopping them getting up to the clean end of the plant, which is where your ready-to-eat product is? Then you push that pathogen on to the consumer or the customer. And in some cases, yes, because it's not a ready-to-eat product. It's a ready-to-cook product. The consumer understands that, the chef understands that, the butcher in the retail store understands that, and they're going to take care of it. Do you have an effective monitoring program? Oh yeah, we have a good program and not finding anything. Then I would tell you, you most likely don't have an effective program, because you should be finding something. Because unless you somehow have got a really good look, you should be occasionally getting positives. The question is, that's not bad. What's bad is if you keep getting them, then you're heading towards possibly being closed down if you're making a ready-to-eat product. When you said you push something back to the supplier, how did you approve that supplier? How did you make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing? How did you make sure that when they say they did it and they send you a COA, they actually did the testing? How are you sure that they're not just sending you the same COA and just changing the lot number? I learned that last week at the SQF meeting, that they said that if you put all your COAs that you got for the last 10 batches and you put them side by side and they all say exactly the same thing, they're not testing. They're just basically going ahead and just duplicating the same COA and sending it to you, and you're not noticing it, that it never ever changes. And never remember in COA there's more than just pathogen testing. There may be moistures there may be stuff like that. So Holly, what type of questions have we got to wrap up the last 15 minutes of our 1 hour?
Yeah, sure. That's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Bob. I'll just remind everyone that we have recorded the webinar, and we will circulate both the slides and the recording of the webinar within a few business days here. Alrighty. You noted earlier, so let me just read through, how do you find pathogenic E. coli strains from other contamination sources apart from fecal matter, or is that the only source indicator?
That's pretty well the only place it comes from, and I think I'm right in saying that E. coli is only associated with fecal matter. It doesn't mean that all E. colis are pathogenic, and so therefore if you want to try and differentiate between them, then you would have to have them tested. But I don't think you want people eating fecal matter even if it doesn't have pathogenic E. coli in it.
Yeah. Okay. How does Salmonella enter the vegetarian's food supply chain?
How does Salmonella enter into that?
Yes.
Well, it's in the intestines of animals, and animals are out there in the fields, and you've got birds out there, and you've got rodents out there, and you've got cattle out there, and they're basically passing their fecal material out, and it's just a natural contaminant in our environment, and it can live out there in conditions that you and I wouldn't be able to survive, and just wait for conditions to be right for it to start growing. So you're bringing some of it in because when you slaughter an animal, if you're not careful, the fecal material gets on the meat, but some of it's coming in on stuff out of the field simply because there's birds and wild animals out there.
Okay. How do you define a ready-to-eat finished product?
How do you define a ready-to-eat product?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Well, obviously, the thing is, if your package indicates that nobody has to do anything with it and the consumer believes it's ready to eat, then they're going to open up the package and eat it. So when you think about those things, cookies and crackers and bread and so on are clearly ready to eat. when you talk about pasta, I don't think too many people are going to chew on dry pasta, so therefore you would say that wouldn't necessarily be ready to eat. One of our problems is people will eat stuff that isn't really ready to eat. And if you think back years ago, how many people would necessarily have eaten sushi, and now they do, and that type of thing. So sometimes the product is eaten raw and eaten as a ready-to-eat product, and sometimes it's still the same raw product.
Okay. Can you comment on Listeria in non-ready-to-eat plant? So for ready-to-cook products, what about, as an example, coffee and brewing? So dry coffee roast.
Well, it's interesting. If you talk about, see, one of the problems happened to the coffee industry is they went from selling coffee where you're going to put 180-degree water through ground coffee beans, and therefore the 180-degree water is going to take care of a lot of problems, to the fact that they now do that for you and sell you an iced coffee, and now it's a ready-to-eat, in this case, ready-to-drink product. And so therefore they've now gone from a plant that wouldn't have been considered having products that are ready to eat, having products in that plant that are ready to eat. In this case, ready to drink. So we're sometimes backing ourselves into the problem because we try to give the consumer something where they don't have to do anything to make it convenient for them. And therefore we made some products that you normally would never have been able to buy as already to be consumed, and now we made them ready to be consumed.
So I guess, is it possible to find Listeria or Salmonella in a dry coffee roast or ground facility?
Yes. The question is, what is your finished product? The finished product is coffee beans or ground coffee, and it's going to be hit with 180-degree water. Nobody's going to be really too concerned about the Listeria that may be in your plant getting into the coffee beans or onto the coffee, ground coffee. But if you're going to make that liquid coffee that's ready to drink, then you have to be careful that it's not in that product.
Okay. So aside from ready-to-eat foods, what would be the most concerning pathogen for manufacturers or processors that are producing anything but ready to eat?
I think Salmonella, and that's why we're seeing Salmonella as being listed there, because Salmonella is obviously a pretty prevalent pathogen out there. It just doesn't have the mortality rate is about 5%, but it's still pretty deadly, and we're getting some antibiotic resistant Salmonella out there, and we've had those problems in the past, and we're getting the FDA and the USDA, in this case what they told us, and the USDA, getting very aggressive about ground beef, and yet that's not a ready-to-eat product. And you're going, well, if you took that ground beef home and you cooked it, wouldn't you get rid of the Salmonella? Yes. But the problem is you're taking Salmonella into somebody's kitchen, and they're now not necessarily going to clean up, just like the flour from General Mills. You should have said, well, that's not ready to eat, so why is that a big problem if it's got a pathogen in it? Because everybody's going to make something and put it in the oven and bake it, and therefore it shouldn't be a problem. No, you've got the flour all around your kitchen, and now you're going to get people. And then we got into people eating the cookie dough, which was raw before they baked it. So I think that's where the regulators are coming from. Even though the actual thing you're selling isn't necessarily ready to eat, they're going, what type of contaminant would it cause in a kitchen? And therefore, the Salmonella or the E. coli would be around, and it would be by cross-contamination, contaminate other things and cause the consumer to have a problem.
Yeah, okay. We have a number of questions, Dr. Bob, that speak to the fact that folks, they do have an environmental monitoring program, and occasionally they find a pathogen, but they sort of respond to it. So is the fact that a pathogen, you alluded to earlier that you really shouldn't be finding it consistently, but then you want to sort of reduce the frequency by which you find these, and that's how you sort of demonstrate through your program that it's effective. But I'll give you a specific question that's sort of on the top end of that. So lots of folks have said, we have an environmental monitoring program, and occasionally we'll find a pathogen. Does that indicate that it's not working? And specifically, this example says, we have, sorry, let me just go back here. Listeria is such an elusive pathogen. We have a fair monitoring program, and when it is presumptive Listeria, it's found and later confirmed as negative. How should any sort of suggestions on how they can sort of further improve the program, the environmental monitoring program?
Well, one of the things, I'm not sure I'd spend money taking a presumptive and going ahead and confirming it. I would basically say I would just spend the money to analyze it and find a presumptive and then react as if it's a positive and save my money. Because if I've got something that suggests I've got it, then maybe I do have it. I would say finding it is not the problem. The problem is finding it and then going back and cleaning where you believed it was, and then finding it again, whether it's a month later in the same area, then you obviously haven't found where it is. And now that starts to become more of a concern. Now you go back and you look at that area and you move a little further over and you start to find it there, and then you start to find the resource. But then a third month it's back again or whatever, then you really do have a problem, because if you're bringing that Listeria into the room. Now, if you want to really get to know whether it's the same Listeria, and this is where you're going to spend a lot of money, but if you really want to go that far, each Listeria has its own DNA, like you and me. So actually, when you get that Listeria, if you were to get somebody to do a DNA on it, and then a week later, a month later, you'll find Listeria and it's got the same DNA, it didn't come back in that room and never left that room. You never got rid of it. It's the same one, because if its brother comes in or its sister, it would have a different DNA. And so, but I'm not suggesting you go to all that type of testing and that expense just to prove it's the same one that's in the room. Just assume it's in the room and it stayed in the room and you didn't get rid of it. Or take the other approach, I keep bringing it in the room and I keep bringing in its brother and its sister, and I'm bringing in different Listeria, and then take a look at what's coming in that room that you can stop coming in that room.
Yeah, okay. A two-part question here. So with the FDA swabathons, if my environmental monitoring program proves that I do not need to be concerned with Salmonella or Listeria species, do I still need to implement a swabbing program?
If you're making ready-to-eat product, by law, you have to be swabbing. And by law, you have to be doing Listeria species. That is by FSMA. That is by USDA. So you can't not be doing it.
Are you able to comment, Dr. Bob? Is that Canadian law as well?
No, that's American law, sorry.
No, that's okay.
So that's American law. For Canadians, it's if you're going to supply a product to America, you have to do it. And so I forgot, I apologize to our Canadian listeners. But that's what the USDA is. Now with CFIA, I'm not sure what CFIA requires, but take a look, because CFIA is tending to monitor a lot of what we're doing here for a couple of reasons. One, we monitor what Canadians do as well, so it's not a one-way street. We recognize the Canadians have a program equal to or better than ours, and so therefore, whatever we're doing, they're doing, and whatever they're doing, we're doing. Yep. I would suspect the CFIA is basically looking at it the same way.
Yeah, okay. Just went through an SQF audit and was hit with not having an environmental monitoring program, even though I had a risk assessment stating that I didn't need to swab due to only selling product, in brackets coffee, for roast ground to brew. Any thoughts you can comment on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And again, don't forget, if you really believe that you got zapped on something that you weren't supposed to be zapped on, you weren't supposed to lose points on, you have every right to appeal that and go to the technical person at your certifying body and say, hey, the auditor hit us for this, and we believe that based on our risk assessment, and we're not making a ready product, we didn't have to have one, and give further advice on why the auditor was right, or get the technical person to agree that you're right and you get your point back.
Okay. I keep hearing the last few years that norovirus is the leading cause of foodborne illness in the United States. Are you aware of any upcoming regulations regarding this pathogen?
Well, obviously the point is that it is, and it is one of the leading causes. And when we start talking about virus and we talk about hepatitis A and norovirus, they are identified as the two leading causes of people contaminating food and then people getting sick. The problem with norovirus is it contaminates the atmosphere in which the person was vomited. And it is a much bigger problem at food service than it is at food manufacturing. And that isn't to say that people don't get sick in food manufacturing plants, but they're more likely. It comes into in a restaurant, And then they get the clientele of that restaurant sick, whereas you don't have the public coming into your plant. And it's generally transmitted from people to people through surfaces that you get in contact with, because the virus stays in that area, and then you touch a door handle, or you touch a toilet seat, or you touch a faucet, or you touch something, and then you get that in your body. Whereas when we're talking about some other things, you're actually eating a food that's more likely to have the virus or the bacteria in it, and you get it that way from people to food to you.
Yep. Okay. Based on your experience for baking products, is it necessary to test for Salmonella or E. coli, given that there is a kill step, in other words, an oven, and limited testing for only Listeria?
Talking now about ready-to-eat products, or talking about selling a product that isn't ready to eat?
My assumption is that it's ready to eat, but there's a kill step there.
A kill step at the manufacturing plant?
It's a bakery. So the kill step is the oven, so that the product is baked.
Okay. Well, the answer is yes. I would occasionally test. Now you say to yourself, why? Well, think about Peanut Corporation of America. They got caught because they assumed the roaster would take care of any salmonella that was in the peanut. And that's not true, because the speed of the oven, the in equal heat from side to side, the depth of the peanuts, etc., etc. And they got caught on the fact that they thought the roaster took care of everything. And that is typically the feeling sometimes in a bakery, is your oven takes care of everything. Well, remember that once it comes out of the oven, then it's going to get contaminated with Listeria, Salmonella, or whatever's in the atmosphere while it's cooling and before you package it. So the oven may have taken care of it and got rid of it, but then you recontaminated it later. So I would say be real careful again that you don't assume you got rid of it and you never got it back in there.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. So just a clarification on an earlier question. If the environmental monitoring program is for a non-ready-to-eat product facility shows that I do not need to be concerned with Salmonella or Listeria species, do I still need to implement a swabbing program?
Now, by law, you don't have to, because you only have to do it if you're doing ready-to-eat product. Now, you say to yourself, well, I'm not doing a ready-to-eat product. Should I be concerned about it? Well, if you believe the consumer is not going to take the product and cook it properly, then I'd be concerned about it. And you can see the regulators are now starting to take a look at not ready-to-eat products and be concerned about pathogens in not ready-to-eat. And that's why we talk about J.B. Tolleson with Salmonella in raw ground beef. Well, who's going to eat raw ground beef? Well, some ethnic groups do. Some people eat steak tartare, which is basically what raw ground beef is. It's not like you can't say some people don't, but most people cook their ground beef. But the question is, do you cook it to the level that it would get rid of everything? And that's why we have that thing with hamburgers where you're supposed to cook it until there's no blood in the middle of it. But then some people like to have a slightly undercooked. So when you start to talk about that, you say, well, what if a consumer doesn't quite cook our product and then they get sick? Will we be held accountable for it? Well, in the USA, with the lawyers the way they're going, and the lawyer who does it is now setting an office up in Canada, so Canadians, you're welcome to him. He's heading your way. Then obviously you have to feel that if you were to cause a class action where you get enough people sick, even though it was a ready-to-cook product, and the lawyer thinks he can build a case against you, he's coming after you. So I think the message is try to keep pathogens out of your product, whether it's ready to eat or not ready to eat.
Okay, very good. Per FDA guidelines, finding Listeria as an indicator organism on food contact surface does not mean that the food contact surface is contaminated with Listeria. Does this hold true for finished product as well?
Well, one, don't be swabbing your food contact surfaces unless you really want to do it, because in America, the US FDA requires you to do it, but they have a limited way you do it, and that's for a longer talk than this. And the FDA doesn't require it, so most people don't do it. But if you do it, and you do find it on the food contact surface, yes, it doesn't mean it's in the product, but it means there's a high probability it's in the product, because how did it get on the food contact surface if it wasn't in the product? Now you got to hold the product, now you got to test the product, and now if you find it in the product can't go out. And if you let it go out, you've got a real headache on your hands now, because you just let the product go out and you didn't wait for the results to come back when you swab the food contact surface, and you go, why would you let it go out the door?
Okay. Our packaging is at times fairly congested with equipment and people. Besides relying on the GMP and sanitation, is there a rule or recommendation on the size and functions within the room? For example, cryovac line and regular packaging line.
That's a difficult question to ask. I'd have to see a facility, because now we're getting into a little bit more consulting than I can do right now.
Sure, that's okay. I heard from a manufacturer that assemble sandwiches that they don't need to test for Listeria or the ready-to-eat in a ready-to-eat sandwich. That said, that they said that they rely on the supplier of the ingredients. Is this wise?
No.
Yeah.
And that's not a true statement either. They're doing ready-to-eat products, and then they have to be doing environmental monitoring, even if they think their suppliers is controlling the Listeria in their plant, the supplier's plant. But that doesn't mean there isn't Listeria in the people making the sandwich plant. And that Listeria is the Listeria that's getting into that sandwich now, not something the supplier may very well have eliminated any Listeria in their plant and sent you an ingredient that's free of Listeria. But we're judging the environmental conditions in the plant that's making the sandwiches.
Okay, last question for today, Dr. Bob. Is it true that some people in the food industry are not really considering E. coli as a pathogen? Like some allowed exceptional release if E. coli results are not in yet?
Well, that's an absolutely foolish thing to be doing. E. coli is a pathogen, and depending on the strain of it, it can be a pretty deadly pathogen. And ask those kids' parents who got to die on the Jack in the Box incident, and others that have died since, that when you say E. coli is not something and we're going to release the product. I wouldn't release the product, and therefore, again, the USDA now considers E. coli 15787 in raw ground beef being an adulterated product, and you better not let it go out the door.
Okay, we'll fit in one more question here, Dr. Bob, and we really will cap it off here. So what would be the most considerable pathogenic bacteria for garlic, onion, turmeric, and ginger? So I guess spices.
Again, that's a little bit more than I can talk in just a couple of seconds.
Fair enough, fair enough. Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bob, for your presentation. I'm sure the folks on the call found it very insightful. Again, we've recorded the webinar to all those who are remaining on the call here. We'll send a link as well as the deck within 2 business days. And with that, I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.